You've had a very interesting journey, completing a bachelor's degree in industrial biotechnology and then going on to do your master's in neuroscience. From there, you went to work as an investigative researcher for the BBC and then transitioned to the public development sector with a focus on fintech and financial inclusion. Tell us about your journey through the various sectors you've worked in.
Sure. So I think neuroscience will always be sort of my first love. When I was growing up, I think science was something that just came really easy to me. It isn't sort of international development or politics or areas I work in now, but science came easy to me. So it was a natural thing for me to go into engineering and neuroscience. And a lot of things that I've learned there, the lateral thinking, the analysis, are things that I can use today. What I feel like is mainly useful in your 20s is that you try and do lots of different things, right? So I did, like, as I said, neuroscience. I worked as a researcher for a while. I did consulting at one of the big four. I worked as an ethics, at an ethics body. And while I knew that I liked science, I think I realized that what I didn't want to do was work in the lab all day. I've spent many a nights actually working and waiting for my gels to run. But what I really missed was projects, and I missed deadlines. I missed working with people. So I used my 20s to sort of experiment and try lots of different things, and try and see what it was that I liked and what made me tick. And then I found myself working at the Bank of England. And why I liked that was, one, being in finance was a big challenge for me because that was not something I'd ever done. So it inculcated in me sort of this desire to learn and desire to understand how markets move, how decisions are made. And so that was what I realized I wanted to work in and what I wanted to focus on. And there's also something about working in policy about making really big and impactful step changes that can affect millions of lives. And I think that's what sort of got me. And that's, in my 20s and doing all of that background work is what I realized is the areas I wanted to focus in. And then after working in the UK for quite a while, I think I worked there for about 14 years, I found myself sort of at the Bank of England, which was it's been a really exciting and interesting playground because it helps you work on international development, and development was always sort of where my heart was. So it's sort of a mottled history, but it's kind of led me to where I am today.
I want to talk a little bit about the space that you've worked in. The fintech sector has a deeply like a great gender imbalance as well. When it comes to the sector itself and the people working in it, have you seen change in the last 15 years that you've worked there? And what do you think are the steps that need to be taken to bridge this gender gap in the future?
I'm going to clarify what you mean by that. Do you mean the gender gap of people working within the sector as opposed to the sector helping? Right. So you're right. There is a big gender gap, right? So there's always been a gender gap in finance, and there's been a gender gap in tech. There's been, there's a lot that's being done to support women and to support women entrepreneurs, and to give them funding. But we still see massive discrepancies in both people working in the sector as well as those they support. Very often, I would quite often find myself in a room where I was the only woman, or quite often the only woman of color. I think things are changing. There's been big efforts made to actually change that. This comes with pros and cons. I think what it needs to do is it has to start at a much lower level. It needs to start at the level of schooling, at university, at how we're taught, about how we're taught to think. So it needs to start differently. But there definitely in the last sort of 10 to 15 years has been a change in the number of people working in fintech, working in finance. And it's very interesting that this also is quite country specific. So if I take the example of Seychelles, when I worked at the Seychelles Central Bank, most of the people in the room are women. When I work in the Maldives, lots of people are women. So working in finance and working in tech. So it is also quite country specific. I think there's there's a lot being done with forums. There's a lot of women supporting each other. But I think there's more that can be done. There is more diversity now in boards. I think in some cases, like the UK and the EU, they're being asked. There's a certain quota. Quota systems can be bad or good. Like there's a balance there that we need to attain. But basically, I guess the end result is there's definitely a benefit in having more women on boards, but there is a long way to go for us to get to sort of the balance.
You've had a brilliant career when it comes to work, but I also want to focus a little bit on your personal life. What's the most adventurous thing you've done in your personal life that gave you a confidence boost for your career?
So I guess maybe one of the so I love new experiences. I'm always sort of trying new things, and both in my personal and my work life. And I have to admit, and I think this is something that's quite important for me to say, is that work maybe makes up about 40% of my life. And I think I spend a lot of time, focusing on my hobbies or focusing on what I like to do. And I think that's important for people to know as well, right? And to people to recognize that work isn't sort of everything. So one of the things I did, and this was probably in my early 30s, was that I took a year off work to go traveling, to go backpacking. Now, in the Western world, this is relatively common. People take a gap year after they finish university and then go off traveling for a while. But for a brown girl from South India, this was not very common. And also I was much older when I did it. So lots of people do it in their early 20s. And so it was quite scary to do it in my 30s. Now, the reason I did it was also a little bit of soul searching. It was sort of like, was I really doing the career that I should be doing? Was I in the place that I should be? So it was more about trying to find what it is that maybe was missing, or trying to have new experiences. So I basically bought myself a one-way ticket, put on a backpack, and then left London, where I was living at the time. And I have to say, it's been the most exciting and exhilarating experiences I've ever had. I don't think I would have the guts to do it again, but there's something quite beneficial in going into the unknown, where you don't know the dangers ahead. But it was amazing. And I said yes to most experiences that were offered. So I lived on a gaucho farm for a while, which is where they breed horses. I went horseback riding in the snow. I worked in an Indian restaurant. I went diving. So I had all these amazing experiences, none of which I would ever trade. But I think what was more important at the end of sort of this 1 year of traveling was that I realized that there wasn't that much to be found, that I was kind of doing exactly what I should have been, what I should be doing. So that in itself was quite it was a very useful process in that sense. And I have to say that in that time, so I was still at the Bank of England, and I did try to quit my job before I went traveling. But I have to say that my supervisors there were very supportive, and instead of letting me quit, sort of let me take a year off and then come back to the job, and then very interestingly offered me a promotion pretty soon after I came back. So sometimes it's good to sort of just go with the flow and go with, instead of forcing something to happen, you should go with your instincts. And that's definitely something that I've sort of used throughout my career, is to sort of go with my instincts a little bit. It's not always easy, but to trust yourself, but it's definitely something that has served me well.